Good morning. I know with the holiday weekend, I know we got quite a few folks visiting with us. I did hand out a couple of the books. Does anybody else need a workbook this morning? We're not really following it. I don't know why I really handed it out, but just everybody in class just laughed at me and smiled like, "Why?" No, just does anybody need one? We're on. If not, we're doing kind of a verse by verse study of James chapter 3 or James this quarter. So if you don't need one, then or you can just follow along. We'll get going here in just a moment, but appreciate. Does anybody need one? Taylor's in the back. All right. All right. Let's go ahead and say a word of prayer, and then we'll get started. Kind of jump in here at the end of chapter 2 and begin chapter 3. Most holy and righteous Heavenly Father, we're indeed thankful for all that we have, all the many blessings. Mindful of those, Father, that may have been involved with the tornado last night in northern Denton County, and just pray, Father, for the health and safety of all those that might be involved in that, and those folks that are doing the search and rescue this morning. Father, mindful of those. We're thankful for having this place and this time and this opportunity to come here and in this place without fear of harm or persecution and study a portion of your word. Pray mindful for all of us as students and the teachers this hour that everything we do is in spirit and in truth, and that we apply the things we learn this hour. We grow closer to one another and closer to Thee. Thank You for all Your many blessings, especially for Your Son and the salvation that He brought through that cross at Calvary. Help us never to take that for granted, and just help us, Lord, as we go through this hour of study. This is our prayer in Christ's name. Amen. All right, let's go ahead and we'll do our memory verse for the quarter, or for the month. It's 2 Samuel 7:16, if everybody wants to say it along with me. And your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. So, thank you, everybody. And like I said, we're going to finish up. We got down talking about, we almost got to Rahab. I guess we got right about, we talked about there being 5 statements of faith in this last portion of chapter 2 of James. And we got down, and I think I got back to the point right about here. We talked about, the second statement of faith in verse 20, faith without works is dead. And I talked about, I asked the question at some point in class last week, who would you pick, right? We got Hebrews 11, but maybe it's somebody in your own life. Maybe it's someone else in Scripture that you think of as that. And then I think right at the end of class, the question got asked. I think Benjamin, I gave him a hard time about it, but he asked the question right at the end of the class, how do we, when somebody wants to come back and say, I'm just not doing enough, right? You get that idea of that, I haven't done enough works, right? And earning your faith. And I think we did talk about that at the end of class, talked about the fact that, like I think Stephen brought up the point about, the talents, that you have the 1 and the 5 and the 10 talent person, and everybody's going to have their differences as far as what they can and can't do in the kingdom. And I think these two people are a great example of that. I asked the question here as far as that because, we think about all the heroes of faith that we would talk about, and yet James picks Abraham, who was he was their father, right? And then you got Rahab, right? And so, if a man was writing the Bible, I think, Rahab might be an afterthought, right? But she's not, right? I mean, she's brought up, and I ask y'all if you want to look at turn over to Joshua chapter 2. And Joshua chapter 2, I mentioned that at the very end of class, as far as what made Rahab special, or how does she demonstrate that? And he says that. Well, let me read first. I'll read James chapter 2, and we'll kind of 21 through or 22 through 26. It says, "Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect? And the scripture was fulfilled, saying, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, and he was called the friend of God." Verse 24 says, "You see then that a man is justified by works and not by faith only. Likewise was not Rahab the harlot justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way. For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also." So now jump over to Joshua chapter 2. And this statement here that I think that, you've got there's several statements. You've got maybe Hannah's, you got Ruth's, there's several profound statements that women of faith make in the Old Testament. But here is Rahab's, and or a statement that she makes to the spies. In verse 9 of chapter 2, it says, "And she said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the sea, of the Red Sea, for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now therefore, I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you also will show kindness to me, to my father's house, and give me a true token, and spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. And so the men answered, our lives for yours, if none of you tell this business of ours, and it shall be, when the Lord has given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with you. Now, what I really wanted to focus on is that statement in verse 11. That part of her statement in verse 11, to me, is just profound, because in all the Old Testament study we've been reading and studying so far, how many times do all the Israelites who saw the 10 plagues, who saw that river, the Red Sea parted, how did they act?
Fearful, doubting at times.
Doubting. I mean, a lot of complaining, a lot of murmuring. You know, I don't know how many times the word murmuring is used in the as far as relation to. But look what she says there. To me, it's just a statement. It says, as soon as we heard these things, they didn't see any of it. But as soon as they heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did they remain any more courage in anyone because of you. And then this last portion, for the Lord your God, He is God in heaven He is God in heaven and above and on earth beneath. So here she makes that statement of faith, right? And not having seen any of the things I think that the Israelites saw firsthand, and yet she can make that statement. To me, that's what makes her like Abraham, right? I mean, that's saying, as far as that. But any other thoughts? What are the thoughts about it? Yeah.
My recollection may not be all that correct, but I think the Hebrew people had crossed the Red Sea at least a couple of weeks before, maybe a couple of years before, maybe 38 years before. The news was still true. People still believed it. People still heard it. Yeah. And that's she didn't see it. Yeah. She wasn't there. Yeah. This is 40 years before. So for her to have that kind of faith is pretty significant.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? To me, it's just Rahab's one of those people that just, what is it? 3 women mentioned in the lineage of Christ, right? And I think that, it's just a powerful statement, right? About her faith. Anything else about this? All right. And then we have in verse 22, which we already read. And again, trying to get to keep us on track there. In that third statement of faith, again, she says, or said about Abraham, or talking in relation to Abraham, is in verse 22. It says faith was working together with his works. And so that idea there, faith working together with works is made perfect or complete. Again, we see that idea of all of them together as far as that goes. And then I think, just talking about, and it talks about him and his faith working together with works made him perfect or complete, and in turn made him a friend of God. And so again, I don't think there's any greater thing that can be said for any of us, right, than if we were a friend of God in that respect. Then going on to the last couple of verses there, we find the fourth statement there in verse 24. It says, you see then that as a man is justified by works and not by faith only. So again, that same idea as man is justified by works and not by faith only. If you probably heard that from other studies. The only place in Scripture that the words are used by faith only are in this text right here, and it's mentioning it's not by faith only. So the only time you see by faith only is right here where it says not by faith only. In Joshua, again, we read that already about Rahab. And then the fifth statement there is made, the last two verses, talking about Rahab, and then the final verse of this second chapter, it says faith without works is dead in verse 26. And then, and again, he makes an interesting comment there at the end of the verse. He says, for as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. And now what's unique about man and the body and the spirit?
Well, it's unique that of all His creation that we have a spirit that's eternal. So that does separate us from all this other creation that was made.
So in that idea, that's what makes us in the likeness of God. And that idea, and again, and what happens if the spirit, if the body passes, or if you don't have one or the other? Did I say that right?
The body without the spirit is dead.
Yeah, and so the same thing, right? So you can't have faith without works, right? And so and we talked about that last week a little bit. But again, just the idea you can't divide the two. The two go together no matter what. Or they're inseparable in that sense. So again, just kind of going through it a little quicker than I probably would have if I'd have finished up last week. But just the idea there, just wanted to finish up chapter 2. And now we jump into chapter 3. And then where we're going to start this week, and that idea of controlling the tongue. And we've seen this topic already mentioned in chapter 1, or at least talked about in chapter 1. And it's interesting how chapter 3 works, is in the fact that some of the things that are talked about in chapter 3 have already been mentioned in chapter 1 or chapter 2, but then we're going to see them brought up again, like the rich and the speaking, or the way we speak and the way we carry ourselves. We're going to see them brought up in chapters 4 and 5 as well. So we're going to see this, the tongue talked about in both. Like I said, we've seen it before. We're going to see it again later on. But I think I just want to read these first two verses when we talk about it, because sometimes I think when we first look at this chapter, it may be these first two verses is like, okay, where do they fit in? But I think it's important to note that what he's going to say here, and I believe this is a point that he's making here. He's going to talk about speech, and then in verses 1 through 12, and then next week, Lord willing, we'll talk about wisdom. Well, in this chapter 1, if you remember, he talked about, in verses 5 through 8, he first talked about wisdom in chapter 1 of this, in the book of James. And then later on, he talked about, the idea of, in 19 through 25 or 26, he talked a little bit about our speech, the idea of being slow to speak but swift to hear and slow to wrath. So I think we see those parallels come out. But when we first start jumping into here, but I think when he talks about here in verses 1 and 2, and he's going to talk about what a teacher needs, obviously the way they speak or the way they carry themselves is also in having that wisdom involved. So I think we'll see that only applies not only to what he's saying here about teachers, but to all of us really. But the first two verses there, it says, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we shall receive a stricter judgment. For we all stumble in many things. If anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able also to bridle the whole body." Now again, I think that not just about teaching an adult class like I am here, but I think anybody that ever teaches anywhere, whether it's a public setting like this, or whether it's teaching one-on-one, or whatever your role is, and from the youngest kids up, I think everybody should read this verse first, right? I mean, and should know this verse, right? I mean, and take this verse to heart, because it's important, right? Because you think about what he says there. It says, "My brethren, let not many of you become teachers, knowing that we should receive a stricter judgment." Man, I'm stumbling over my words this morning. I apologize, but receiving a stricter judgment. Why? And I think I asked the question here: how much influence do your teachers in the past, how much influence do teachers have on a person, on a group, JD?
They have quite a bit of influence over those whom they teach. Like foundational, shaping kind of influence.
How many people remember, I mean, everybody has a favorite teacher. If you ask Miles, I think his favorite teacher was still his second grade teacher that he had, Miss Hunt, I believe was her name. I think he had a crush on her. I think that was more of it. Sorry. Claire, but I think if you ask him about it this morning, but no, I remember he invited her to his birthday party. That's how bad he had it for Miss Hunt. But anyway, and she came to his birthday party, matter of fact. So I'm sorry. But how much influence do your teachers have on you? I mean, and to what JD said. I mean, does everybody in here remembers probably as soon as you say it, right, you probably remember the best teacher you ever had, but you also probably remember the worst ones, right? And what separate those people? What separated those teachers? The good ones. We'll just talk about the good ones. What?
Typically the ones that you connected with, the ones that care, the ones that spend good time with you, and that you're learning from as well.
What else?
I think the ones that had a passion for what they were teaching.
Yeah, you can tell they truly loved what they were doing. They had that passion about them. What else? What else makes a good teacher? Steve?
The good ones seem to challenge their students in various ways beyond what they can currently do. I mean, that's the whole point. You want them to improve over that period of teaching.
Yeah.
So challenging, making you feel a little uncomfortable, asking you to do things that maybe you've never done before. Those are things that are, I think, earmarks of a good teacher.
Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
They don't try to do things for themselves. So when you do something, you want to do something for the hearer, not the one speaking it. You want to, that's how you say things in a class like this. You're not saying it so that you vault yourself up or use lots of flowery language or speak like, look how smart I am. But you want to do it to where you make sure it connects the best way with the person who hears it. And that's true if it's one-on-one too. You find something that they can connect to.
Yeah, and I think that the connection is, yes.
So one of my favorite teachers was Miss Cyan. She was my third grade teacher. She could be a little brusque, but for some reason that resonated with me, almost like a challenge, but it worked well. But I also think about my librarian in grade school. Back when we had, you pulled out the box to look up books with cards. I would always ask, where's the book? And she would say, go look it up. Not sometimes just in teaching Bible classes or one-on-one Bible studies, but they come in different areas as well. And that makes me think of leadership and influence and the importance that Christians have in monitoring that, because we all have that in some way. So how we're teaching, how we're behaving, that was something else that I think draws us to teachers. How do they behave? Does it match what they speak? Are they kind? Are they passionate? So kind of all of that together, for me, makes a good teacher.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And I think all those are right. And I think it comes down to that connection, right, and that understanding there. But also, and we'll talk about that next week more so as far as the wisdom side of things. But I will tell a personal story real quick just to kind of put this in perspective, because I think it helps this part about the teachers, but also what we're about to say about the speaking and how we speak and how we carry ourselves and the damage that can be done. Back when Amy and I first got married, we went to a small congregation in Bowling Green, Kentucky, and the gentleman that was the preacher there was kind of semi-retired, so all he taught just did the lessons, but then all the Bible classes were left up to the men, and there's probably 30 or 40 members there at the congregation. Well, the gentleman that was teaching the Bible class, and literally I had maybe been a Christian for less than a year at this time, right? I think we were still dating when we went there, But anyways, one Sunday the teacher was going to be gone, and they asked me. Well, I had no business teaching that Bible class. I can tell you that much right now. But I was just eager, and I studied all I could that week. And I remember it was on 1 Peter, and I did all I could. And so I got up there, and I was muddling through class, and with a lot of help. And I was just like, but then a question got asked of me, and I just froze. I just literally locked up. I couldn't think of what to say, how to say it. And the preacher, he ended up saying, kind of bailing me out. It seemed like an eternity. It was probably only a few seconds, but he kind of bailed me out of it a little bit. But after that, so I had no reason to be teaching that morning at all. But then afterwards, when he got up and did his sermon, he worked in the sermon the idea of that men, when they get up to teach, should be qualified. And we shouldn't just ask anyone and everyone to teach a Bible class. And so I was just like, and I remember, I was just mortified. You know, I was just like, you know, and I learned a couple things there. One is not to volunteer for something you're not qualified to do. And the second thing is I learned that lesson right then that day that, you know, you should always praise in public and reprimand in private. And so I wish that to this day, and you can tell it's 34 years later, I still wish that he had pulled me aside and kind of coached me through that instead of, I felt like throwing it out there in front of everybody. But again, you kind of see, I think both of these things brought up there is, you know, understanding that you've got to have the ability and understanding too what you're up against, not what you're up against, but what the value are of teachers. Like, and everything that everybody said here is right about the connection and all that. But also I want to think about this is who are teachers today? And we kind of started to say something about that, but where... And I'm going to, if I ask it the other way, I know everybody's going to get where I'm going with this, but who are the teachers today? Who are teachers? And some have said that if we say about personal work and all that, but where do we get our information today?
Well, I think about a couple of things. One, you're talking about the church.
Well, church, and but also secularly. I mean, as far as that.
Well, I just thought about Ephesians chapter 4. I mean, where he talks about he gave some to be apostles. Well, we don't have any who are living. We still have their words and the words of the prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. So that kind of gives us some perspective. That's what you're looking for.
But in the worldly sense, where do we get our information?
Fortunately, the internet.
And that's kind of where.
That's what comes to my mind is social media as far as what the teacher is for a lot of people today.
Well, and that's kind of where I was going is that, you know, like I said, it doesn't take much ability to post something online, does it? And it seems like so many people get their information or statistics or information about things, and we're not sure, I mean, really don't know if it's a credible source or not, right? I mean, as far as that, and checking that thing, and so many people do that. And I think that's where I wanted to make sure that we don't look at people like that as teachers, right? Understand that, I think we need to kind of vet our teachers in some way, right? And understand that, not all the information that's out there, it's great. I mean, to be able to Google something and find something out. In fact, some things we're going to talk about here in a little bit that I wanted to bring up this morning, I did that very thing to try to get that information. But I just think when we think about that, is knowing how important teachers were in our lives, I don't think we want to sell that short, as far as making sure that person's qualified and making sure that that person is knowledgeable on the subject and has that wisdom that we're going to talk about next week. Does that make sense? I just don't want to, like I said, we watered down. I think where Benjamin was going with the idea of what, where we should be as teachers. We know over in Hebrews it talks about that, by now we should have been teachers, but at the same time, you've got to go through that and you've got to learn and you've got to grow. And I think that's part of what we've been talking about already in chapter 1 and even chapter 2 is the works that we do and the things that we do prepare. Like I said, hopefully I would do a whole lot better if I had to teach a lesson on 1 Peter now than I would have 34 years ago, right? But if I'm not, then that's on me as far as, not being able to answer that question that was asked of me that morning. Now, I might still stumble on that question, I don't know. But anyways, the idea there is to be better prepared for that. And then again, the idea there, he says there in verse 2 that, for if we all stumble in many things, if anyone does not stumble in word, he is a perfect man, able to also to bridle the whole body. And I put up there 1 Timothy 1, verses 6 and 7, where he says there, and he talks about that, says, back up to verse 5, it says, now the purpose of the commandment is to love from a pure heart, from a good conscience, and from a sincere faith, from which some, having strayed, have turned aside to idle talk, desiring to be teachers of the law, understanding neither what they say nor the things which they affirm. And the idea there is so you've also got to have what when you want to be a teacher? You got to have knowledge, but you also have to have the right motivation, don't you? I mean, you got to do it for the right reason, right? And I think somebody mentioned that earlier. We don't want to just be boastful and proud of think, you were talking about that. That kind of goes into that, right? Are you doing it for the right reasons? If somebody's standing here or doing whatever, and unfortunately, we've probably all known people and that were very knowledgeable, but it's like they wanted to make sure you knew that, right? And that they had that knowledge. Yes.
So I'm a teacher, and so
Oh, okay.
this is stepping on my toes a little bit. It's like some of the things you're saying, I'm like, oh, I should think about that with my students more. But something that I guess this is having me reflect on is like, you don't have to be a specific type of person to be able to teach. You can learn to be the type of person with the right motivations.
Yeah.
Like everyone has the ability to grow, including
Oh, yeah.
teachers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I'm sitting here going, well, I got a lot of things to grow in to be a better teacher. But I don't know. I guess sometimes I can find myself in that like, well, I'm not like this naturally inclined to be like this. I wouldn't be good at that. It's like, well, no. You can learn to be. You can grow in anything.
And I think and not to put you on the spot, but I think by you, the very essence of saying you realize you have shortcomings as a teacher, that's positive, right? If you were sitting there and saying, I know this, I've got all these boxes checked, then you got a problem, right? And I think no greater example, and I know most people here are going to know them. If you want to talk about styles in teaching, I can't think of, being in Texas, I can't think of anybody better than Russ and Dee Bowman. If anybody knows a new brother Dee Bowman and know Russ Bowman, both of them are fine gospel preachers, great gospel preachers, but I don't think their styles can be any different, right? As far as, how Dee was very, they're both articulate. Russ is going to get in trouble. I'm going to get in trouble with him if I say this wrong. But if y'all know him personally, if you know if you knew Dee in his smooth style and that radio voice and then the way Russ carries himself and their style. And I remember talking to Russ one time about it. His worst thing would have been if he'd have tried to be like his dad. That would have been the hardest thing for him because it just wasn't his style, right? So, everybody's style is different, right? And so those two folks come to mind this morning, but just that, you've got to find, if you want to grow in that, you've got to find what works for you, right? And what, if you try to be like someone else, that's going to hurt your growth. And so, any other thoughts on that before we move on? All good thoughts. I appreciate that very much. So again, just the idea there is if we stumble, and it kind of goes back to why we're doing it, and he mentions there, he starts to mention it here, and he's going to talk about that through the rest of this section. If we control our tongue, how much control do we have? What does he say in verse 2? You got it, right? If you control it, and he's going to use about 3 examples here that he's going to talk about in this next group, and when he's talking about this, as far as and let's just read through these the examples here. We'll read about 3 through 8 here. It says, "Indeed, we put bits in horses' mouths that they may obey us, and we turn their whole body. Look also at ships. Although they are so large and are driven by fierce winds, they are turned by a very small rudder wherever the pilot desires. Even so, the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of hell, and it is set on fire by hell. For every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind. But no man can tame the tongue. It is an unruly evil, full of deadly poison." And I'll go ahead and read verse 10, or I'll go ahead and just read down to verse 10. "With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceeds blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so." So again, I didn't really break that out there. But what are the examples there that he uses? What's the first one that he uses? Yeah, JD? Horse and a bridle, or a bit in its mouth. Now, how many people here are into riding horses? Because a few. Anybody? I figured in Texas I'd find more people riding horses. But he raised his hand for me back there. First off, when I was looking this up, I was surprised how many different bridles or bits you can. I didn't realize there was I found a list of 15 different ones. I was like, who knew? With all this. But what does that do? Obviously you've got this 1,500, 2,000 pound animal, right? And that reins and that bit in its mouth, it does what for you? It controls the horse. Why?
Because it puts pressure on the upper part of the mouth,
And it's painful.
Yeah, that's what, and that's what I was reading about the bits as far as that depending on that, because they have to work with the horse to get it used to it when it's young, and then you have to find the certain ones, and some can pinch more than others, and all. I learned more about bridles and bits this week than I probably could, but the idea there is that, right? But it does. It's effective in the fact that it turns that horse. JD, what were you gonna say? Oh,
Basically, the same thing. It's the same thing with snakes. You control the head, you control the whole body.
yeah. Yeah, and so the idea there is the idea of this, but you have this huge animal, this large animal that is controlled by this. And so what is the point that I think that that James is trying to make there, right? That we learn that with what about ourselves?
Well, almost made an analogy. It's easier to tame an animal than it is for us to tame and train ourselves. Because on the one hand, we can say things that are encouraging and very positive, and on the next, we can say things that tear people down to the point where that resonates with them sometimes for a lifetime. So we're not supposed to be that way, and to be able to control our own tongue takes an incredible amount of strength and focus on God to do that.
Yeah, I meant to ask that at the beginning of class, and I think we talked a little bit about this in chapter 1 when we first talked about the tongue, and I've asked this before in classes, and I won't ask it again, but just the idea of when you think about the major pains or hurts that you've had in your life, most people will go back to more so than a physical harm, like you broke a bone or broke a leg or whatever it might have been. Most people will go back to something they said. I guarantee you, every one of y'all right now are probably thinking about something that somebody said to you at some time, like I mentioned that story with me and that preacher, right, getting called out about what a poor job I did, which was true in the Bible class. And so I hope Miles doesn't call me out this morning, so he's not in here. But the idea there is that you know, understanding that the most painful things that happen to us sometimes are the things people say. And obviously, and especially if it's somebody that we care about, right? If somebody we respect and have that, if that's something that's said, and I think we all got to do that, not only as we talking about teachers, but just as people in general. Yes.
Sorry, I don't mean to.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
So something I struggle with, I feel like as a teacher, and I'm reflecting on more is like I'm like married now. Like the thought of having children is like on your mind. Being a parent is on your mind. Like how do you be a good parent? You know, and so it's like this balance of like tough love versus like being empathetic. Like there's this balance, right? That sometimes as a teacher, sometimes I'm real stern, and I'm like, maybe I was too stern that time. Maybe that kid didn't need to hear that at that time, or like maybe they needed to hear it because like that's what's resonating with them. So I don't know. I remember like when I was writing my Mother's Day card for my mom, I was reflecting on some lessons she tried to teach me, and I would kick back so much as a kid, like I don't want to do that, like. And then I like reflect on it now as an adult, and I'm like, you're just trying to teach me to be a respectful person, or you're just trying to teach me to be like empathetic or think of others, and I just didn't want to do it at that time, you know. Yeah. And so I don't know. It's like maybe at the time we you know, it hurt our feelings or it like bothered us, but then it's like we take some time to, you know, wisen up. We look back on that and go, oh, you know, they were just trying to teach me, or, you know, I don't know. We're not going to do it.
And again, we won't go back around to everybody that brought up the teachers, but I would almost venture to be positive that most of the teachers that were brought up or people that were connections made, or it's probably those ones that were harder on you. I go back to the sports thing, right? You know, a lot of times, and I can tell you the first football coach I had was Mr. Burchett, and he was very hard as far as a lot of things. And I promise you, when I played football for him in the 7th grade, I did not like him. I mean, I did not like him at all. But over time, I got to see what the reasons why he was the way he was, right? And he wasn't disrespectful to you, but he was demanding in such a way because, you know, and that type of thing. And I think teachers are the same way, right? Yeah, John.
Several of the sins are a series of bad decisions where we could pump the brakes at any moment. If you think about David's sin with Bathsheba, a series of poor decision making. But if you rewind those types of sins all the way back to the very beginning, it starts with being able just to say no. Yeah. How the tongue can escalate or de-escalate a situation very quickly. Yeah. And if we can develop the self-control to be slow to speak, then we'll have better brakes for those sins that take a few more bad decisions.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's, and I think I've got a list and a slide upcoming that talks about, some of the sins of the mouth and some of the things that are, to our speech. And one of those things, you talk about lying, for example. I remember a gentleman I used to work with, we were with a guy who was kind of known to, to lie. And he would just, depending on the audience, he would move the truth around to suit him or whatever you want to say about it. But I remember we broke for a meeting one time, and the other gentleman was in a room. He walked up to me, and after the meeting, and this other gentleman was there, and he goes, "Chuck," he said, "whatever you do," he said, "always tell the truth. Always be up front. So the truth only hurts once, right? You get it out there." And he said, "You can have a really poor memory if you tell the truth, right?" You know what I'm saying? Because you don't have to worry. And I've always thought that kind of it's always stuck with me, not just in work, but obviously being a Christian and the focus we have on that. What's the other thing that he mentions here as far as he mentions the horse with the bridle or the bit in its mouth? What's the second analogy that he uses? What's that? Ship and its rudder. And what's the relationship to a rudder and a ship and its rudder? JD?
The rudder, despite being infinitesimal compared to the entirety of the rest of the ship, it's the thing that technically that's on the ship that has the most power. Sure, it moves with the sails, catching the wind and the waves, but at the end of the day, that small rudder, that tiny shift, one way or the other, there is the one that directs truly which direction the ship goes. The wind and waves provide the power, it's the rudder that provides direction.
Yep, that's a great point. And he talks about the fierce winds here. And remember back in chapter 1, he talked about those winds, or being tossed to and fro if we don't have wisdom. So we're going to see that kind of tie in later. But when we talk about the size of a rudder to a ship, again, I had to look it up to see, just to kind of get some kind of relation to this, and not that this narrows it down a whole lot, but it said on average, what I looked up again, is 1.5 to 10%. 1.5% to 10% is the size of a rudder to just the displacement of the boat under the water. So in other words, the part of the boat that's under the water, the rudder is only 1.5 to 10% at most of the ship. And I just thought that was, talking about the size of it, that's kind of a pretty wild number when you think about it. But again, the power that it has, to what JD said, and again, the idea of the same thing as a bridle on a horse's mouth, that ship's going to turn wherever that rudder takes it, right? Whatever it does, and it's going to use that, and same kind of thing there. And then the final one that he mentions here is what does he, and the final one, and I think this is the one that we probably think about the most when we talk about the tongue and the damage that it can do. What's the final one that he mentions? What's that? Fire, right? And we say, and he mentions that in this verse, it says, "Even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how great a forest a little fire kindles." And this was one that I just, in thinking about this, and I don't know if anybody, and I hope I don't hit on strike a nerve with anybody this morning, if anybody knows anybody up in the Panhandle area that was a part of those, the widespread fires just back in late February and early March this year. I was looking that up just because I was looking up about forest or fires and things, and about getting started by a little spark. And actually, the one that happened earlier this year, it actually started up in the Panhandle in I think it's Hutchinson County, if I got the information right. It's referred to now as the Smokehouse Creek fire, because it started, or actually when it started there in Hutchinson County, it was on, let me get the dates right, February 26th. It started at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. It wasn't contained until March 16th, 19 days later. It was started by a down power line, a gust of wind up there, broke an electrical pole. The spark hit the ground. It started the fire, and it estimated that within 24 hours, at the end of the toll of over the 19 days, and the numbers are just amazing to me, 1,058,482 approximate acres were destroyed. That's 1,654 square miles. It went from Texas in the Panhandle all the way over into Oklahoma over the 19 days. There was 2 deaths and $4.6 million in damage is what was done by that series, that blaze that started that afternoon on March 26 or February 26th. But what was amazing to me about that, or just astonishing, was they're saying of that 1,058,000 acres, over 500,000 acres was destroyed in the first 24 hours. And that's just astounding to me. That, you know, and I guess to me that's exactly what James is talking about here, and what a little spark or something we say can do, and the damage in relation to being like fire, right? That a little spark, if anybody's ever had someone or family or friend that's had a house fire, and how quickly those things can spread, right? And things like that. But just putting that in perspective, I just thought that was an amazing thing. And again, I feel bad for anybody that was in that area that it had to experience that. But just to think about that it started from a down power line and a spark started on the street. Yeah, JD?
I have not been at that fire, but I have experienced, well, not really been in the middle of it, but I have experienced the side effects of a massive fire. I used to live in California, the Pasadena area specifically, and there was one time in the mountains, there was this huge fire, and I'm talking so big, the smoke from those blazes actually kind of altered the sunlight, so that everything had this sort of yellow tint to it, and there were a couple days, maybe several, where it basically snowed/rained ash. Just whenever you're outside. So, yeah, I can see what a little spark can do to an entire forest.
And again, the idea there again, the idea of a smoke and a fire, or a fire that starts like that. We often talk about it. I mean, I've used the expression before when somebody sends an email or calls or says something. They went scorched earth on that. They went extreme on it. Whatever they did, as far as how they handled themselves or how they carried themselves. But the idea there again, the damage that can be done, and that's exactly what he's talked about in these two things. We're going to go whichever way, the bit in the mouth of a horse or the rudder of the ship. But again, understanding the damage that can be done. And again, James doesn't talk about it in here, but we're not going to talk that much about it this morning. But just the idea of how much good can be done, also, Darren.
I think the interesting thing with using a forest, you think a forest burning down, it won't ever recover in your lifetime. It'll never be the same in your lifetime.
That's a great point. That's a great. Yeah. Yeah, it's just exactly. And it's going to be that scars are going to be left there, right? And so and talked about that small members can control a lot. The tongue influences the whole body, and then kind of got behind here a little bit. The dangers, damage done, and again, this is the list, and we're going to run out of time here, so I'm not going to turn to these passages, but these are just some passages that came up as regard to sins involving the tongue. Over in Revelations 21:8 talks about lying. Obviously, the famous quote of Job's wife, curse God and die. Gossip, obviously, is one that is greatly talked about. Slander, Proverbs 20:19. Boasting, filthy talk. I think that's the last one. And one more. They were actually in the book here, slow to wrath, right? And so all these, but just one thing I was going to ask, and it's almost to answer it. But when we look at all those and we think about all those sins, how do we avoid them? Goes back to what Joanne said, right? Be slow to speak. Go ahead, Stephen.
I was just thinking, when I get to that passage, but no man can tame the tongue. I have to think about kind of where the motivation is for our tongue, what controls the tongue, and that's our heart. You look at Matthew 15:18, when Jesus is talking about the tongue, he says, but those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile man. And then he goes on to talk about sins that proceed out of the heart. So the best way I think I can control my tongue is to change my heart. To change my heart so that what proceeds from my mouth is really motivated by God's love, the way He wants me to be. I think about the rudder. There's somebody who's turning the wheel, to guide the ship. If I just let that wheel go, I'm not controlling my tongue. If I'm the rider on the horse, I just let go of the reins and let the horse go wild. I need to be the one in charge of actually motivating what that tongue says by a good heart.
That's a great point. That's a great point. And again, that self-control that comes from the change of heart.
Ephesians 4:29, let no corrupt talk come out of your mouths, but only such as good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. So, don't say those things.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, JD?
I don't know how much this is synonymous with the previous two statements, but I would say another one that it sounds like the best way to me to control the tongue is to act with wisdom, even though wisdom often comes from experience. I'd like to think that it is still possible to act wisely as if you have that experience, even without it, if you just slow down, look at the situation, and think, how will this affect things both short-term and long-term?
I was just thinking about what you said about, the emails where they went scorched earth. Like a lot of times too, we don't realize too, going back to the fires of Companion, that fire didn't start with a big, huge bonfire that somebody intended to start that way. It started with, like you said, one little spark. And sometimes we need to realize that even if we didn't go off on somebody and try to tear them down, it's just one little sentence that before you know it, you completely broken somebody down. And that was not necessarily your intent. But if you took your time and thought about better how to say words, we wouldn't end up with scorched earth.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, and again, how we communicate and how we talk to people, I was going to say, it reminded me, sometimes with email and texting and things like that, the worst thing about those to me is you can't tell the emotion, right? And I had a person that worked for me years ago, and she was the sweetest person in the world. She sent the worst emails in the world to people. I mean, her emails were horrible. It got so bad that everybody was complaining, so I finally printed out 3 or 4 of her emails, and I went into her office and said, hey, I want to do this, and I hope you understand why I'm doing this. I want to read this as if I sent this to you. So I read 3 or 4 of her emails to her. And by the time I got to, I think it was the second one, she was crying. And she just had never read her own emails to the point of how she was coming across to her coworkers. And I was just like, so I would advise you, work on your email etiquette, but I think you're a lot better off just picking up the phone and calling them. Because I said the way she was on talking versus emails, night and day. And it was just, we got to work on our communication, definitely.
In Nehemiah 5, when he heard about the injustice with the people, he says in verse 6, I became extremely angry when I heard their outcry and these complaints. After seriously considering the matter, I accused the nobles and officials. So Nehemiah took that time to pause, to ponder, probably more than just a few seconds or even a few minutes, maybe even a day or so, to allow himself to have that anger, process what was going on. So sometimes there's just great wisdom not saying anything and really getting the facts or making sure that you're controlled before you actually do something.
And I know we'll kind of stop here. We'll have a little bit left on this first section to finish up. I'll just leave you with this one. It's kind of like what we're talking about. I forget where I heard this story the first time, and you've probably heard this analogy before too. But it's like, just picture yourself when you're talking sometimes of going around and you've got a bucket of gasoline in one hand and you got a bucket of water on the other. And you come up on a fire, you come up on a situation, you've got a choice which one you're going to throw on that. So you see that little spark, you going to throw gasoline on it, or you going to put water on it? And, and that makes a lot, what I'm saying, as far as how you're going to handle that situation. Are you going to help to calm that situation down, or are you going to, add to it or inflame that situation? But again, I think what we said too, and what Stephen was saying earlier is, obviously it comes from the heart and where our intentions are. So we've always kind of wrapped up everyone. Obviously, where does this fit in this morning to what's going to make us more steadfast and movable this year? How does what we have talked about this morning?
Choose how to use the untamable tongue wisely.
Yep. Stephen?
It's hard to always be a bounty if we're misusing our tongue.
Yeah, definitely. We got to be stronger with that. So, anyways, I'll leave it there this morning, and we'll pick up right there about verse 7 or 8 for next week. Appreciate everybody's comments. Thank y'all.